My brother just told me. Jay, why are we laughing so much? How many years, John?
I started teaching Hamlet when Lyndon Johnson was president.
And she says, I met the youthful Lord Paris at Lawrence's cell and gave him what becoming love I might, not overstepping the bounds of modesty.
No, I already did that with the other
I should
guy.
say that.
Him and Beowulf and...
But you know, when he dies, he's like desperate to be remembered. Tell my story. Remember me. Should we be doing this? Should we stop right now?
No.
Well, it's true. And if you're doing it's in music, it's in literature, it's in everything. And the romantic movement, I'm excited to learn more about it with you as we go through this.
Me too.
Go through the series together. And I'm glad to revisit it in a different way. Like I've revisited it for class, for teaching British literature, but I've found it limiting. The students I've ended up teaching haven't been able to go down the path that far with it. I'm blaming them, which is against my principles. But it feels kind of true. So I'm really happy to go down it with you, and walk back through it. And it brings back some of my, I don't know, most primal, back when you're trying to figure out what you're trying to do, in college, undergrad.
Totally.
And what you like and where you live, where you belong. The romantic movement felt like a home, for the first time. And it surprised me enormously.
Yeah, I'm with you. I'm going to share a poem to start.
Yeah.
Because
what do you got?
we do have tradition. I could sing tradition from Fiddler on the Roof. Tradition. So I love this poet, Tony Hoagland.
Yeah.
And there was a poem called Romantic Moment, but I had already read that one, I think.
Right.
So this is a poem of his called Wind Chime. And I don't forget, I was just flipping through one of his books and I found this. And I think it might connect to some of the spirit of what we're talking about. And it might not.
Okay.
So Tony Hoagland is worth reading. He passed away, I think, of cancer a couple of years ago. His book, Brief Unincorporated Persons of the Late Honda Dynasty, and then the great title, What Narcissism Means to Me, which is,
that.
But he's one of those poets who can be very serious and hysterically funny.
Yeah.
So I like this. It's called Wind Chime by Tony Hoagland. She goes out to hang the wind chime in her nightie and her work boots. It's 6:30 in the morning, and she's standing on the plastic ice chest, tiptoe, to reach the cross beam of the porch. Wind chime in her left hand, hammer in her right, the nail gripped tight between her teeth, but nothing happens next because she's trying to figure out how to switch number 1 with number 3. She must have been standing in the kitchen, coffee in her hand, asleep when she heard it, the wind blowing through the sound the wind chime wasn't making because it wasn't there. No one, including me, especially anymore, believes till death do us part, but I can see what I would miss in leaving, the way her ankles go into the work boots as she stands upon the ice chest, the problem scrunched into her forehead, the little kissable mouth with the nail in it.
Wind Chime.
Love it.
Tony Hoagland.
Yeah,
that's a romantic movement poem right there.
Love it.
It completely is. That's lyrical ballads.
There you go.
That's the grand, the spectacular, till death do us part in the small moments.
Yeah.
In the ordinary language and the unrhymed lines. That's nice. Tony Hoagland's Wind Chime. Check him out if you don't know Tony Hoagland. And by way of introduction, and I are starting a new series here, which we're going to wander through in whatever way seems best to us on the romantic movement, the romantic poets, and maybe also a romantic novel, the romantic novel, probably the archetypal romantic, if not novel, at least the archetypal romantic character. Which is Victor Frankenstein and his doppelganger, the monster, or maybe it's the other way around. And so we'll move into that. But that's what we're starting off with here in this episode tonight. And we want to look at poetry, romantic poetry. But before we started, we were talking about music, and I had gone and seen Mahler's Fifth Symphony this weekend, and understood Mahler generically as a romantic artist. He fits in the time frame, but I don't know his music at all. But was struck by the movements as being unstructured, and that's one of the ways I understand the romantic movement, as a response to a destroyed classical world, a classical world of classical order that had fallen apart. I picture French Revolution and the destruction that's sort of typified. I don't know that like a historian knows it, but
Yeah.
the picture of the collapse and fall of the ancient regime, of
Mhm.
the Catholic world order, of the monarchy, of all that world order, and an attempt to rebuild. And that's what the Romantic movement, that's its project, or that's what unifies all the various Romantic thinkers, from artists to historians, writers, and musicians. So
Yeah.
that's what I'm interested in talking about. I don't know. How do we tunnel into this?
Yeah, I've been doing a lot of thinking because frankly, this is way better than the grading that I'm not doing.
Ah, yes.
But then again, so is taking out the trash, so the bar is low. I had a busy weekend at concerts, so Sunday I watched sports all day.
Yeah, there you go.
I just no, I had I had church. I am a musician at church.
Yeah.
So I was there all morning, but then in terms of the afternoon and night, nope. I gave myself that gift.
There it is.
So a lot of the last couple of days, I was just kind of poking around, thinking about this, journaling about this, and I have vivid memories of I wasn't a reader growing up, and one thing led to another in college, and by luck, I became an English major, and I just ran into people who really inspired me. But one of the very first serious English classes I had as an undergrad was Romantic literature, and I remember that my teacher, who's a good friend of mine now, she was my main mentor, Megan Cronin. She taught each text we engaged as its own thing. I think Romantic literature, maybe more than any other time period, Anglo-Saxon, Middle English, Renaissance, Neoclassical, Romantic, Victorian, Modern, I think the Romantics and maybe the Moderns, there's the greatest danger in reducing them to its four ideas, and here they are.
Yeah.
As if Wordsworth, Blake, Milton, Shelley, and Byron all had like drinks one night and agreed on a set of principles.
Right. Yeah. You see them all shaking on her, putting their hands in the middle, like,
it's
nothing.
And I don't know, like I remember as a young kid in college and even as a new teacher, having my British literature students memorize what I learned, which is the dates of the beginnings and end of each time period. And I can recite them for you. But I'm pretty sure that, for example, the day Queen Elizabeth ascended to the throne, everybody wasn't rocking around saying, hey, the Romantic period's over, we're starting the Victorian period.
Right.
So
what a relief, huh?
Right. Yeah.
It's true. It's true. And they weren't all going around saying, don't you hate science, and don't you hate reason, and don't you hate the Enlightenment, and don't you want to prioritize emotion? Or it's kind of tacky. They're almost tacky, sort of trite representations of these poets, of these writers.
Well, I was reading today that the term romantic for these artists was conjured in the late Victorian period, several decades after any of the Romantics were writing anything.
Really?
And and they didn't see themselves as romantics in real time.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, I think I wrote down here that I think more than any other time period, they can be reduced to like a hallmarky kind of moral of the story is.
Right.
And I think it's because we can get tricked into thinking I'm going to say something moderately controversial, maybe. I can't think of a thing the Romantics thought of that was new.
Yeah.
Okay. I would be willing I'd be willing to guess. I'm going to sound so arrogantly, like Harold Bloomish, and I don't want to.
Sure.
I can't think of a thought in a Romantic poet that doesn't have its antecedent in either Shakespeare or Milton.
Wow.
I think what's new is the context of the composition is new. And I also think the way the ideas are structured, that a Romantic sonnet is different musically and lexically than a Miltonic or Shakespearean sonnet. So it isn't as if they're just doing a 19th century ChatGPT. It's not that. But I think reducing books to ideas, which is not what we're going to do.
Right.
Particularly very generic ideas, endangers us in missing the magic of books themselves.
Yes.
And that if there's a sort of a pro-nature, anti-technology vibe that exists in Blake, which it certainly does, it exists in Wordsworth, but it's very different.
Right. Right.
You and I have talked about Tintern Abbey as being this. I mean, how amazing, Paul.
Yeah, it's overwhelming. Right? It's overwhelming. It's ground zero for me, Tintern Abbey. specifically.
I remember you saying you had memorized a bunch of it, right?
Yeah, I did. Basically, the second section of it, the middle
I
portion of
love
it.
that.
Yeah,
I love
and I
that.
want to read some of that tonight. But it's yeah, I like that. There's no new ideas. I'm reading about the Romantic movement from a historian of ideas, Jacques Barzun, formerly of Columbia University, and he has a very interesting take on it. He says anything you say about the Romantics, you can find someone who everyone agrees is a romantic who doesn't agree with that thing. So
Right.
if you're saying it's anti-rationalist or anti-enlightenment, well, you can find, he says, even he talks about how Percy Shelley himself was enamored of science and had dabbled in
Yeah.
biology and I don't know what else.
And also, like, you and I could do a thing on Coleridge's Biographia Literaria, and that's science and philosophy and theology and psychology and epistemology. It's all of that.
Yeah.
So I
So
just don't want
you
to.
can't part them out. And that way you're saying like that Hallmark card sort of, oh, we know the Romantics only cared about feelings. You know, they were all sitting around the woods
Right.
crying, you know, all the time and hated math, you know, and failed algebra 1. That's
Right.
You know,
That's right.
that's just not it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I also think I spent a lot of time in college studying, not a lot of time, but I studied literary theory relatively closely.
Yeah.
And I think of lines that I still remember from the preface to Lyrical Ballads, which is Wordsworth and Coleridge's landmark volume of poetry.
Right.
In the preface, which I think is written by Wordsworth, if I remember correctly,
I think so.
has lines that say poetry is emotion recollected in tranquility, and poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. In Shelley's defense of poetry, poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world.
Yeah.
So you have these like philosophical pronouncements that you could actually agree or disagree with. But I like to divorce them from the actual poetry, because I think I don't think the Romantics, at least the ones I just mentioned, were good philosophers at all. I think they were excellent poets, though.
Yes. Yeah. They're not analytical.
Because if poetry was the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, anybody with powerful feelings could be Wordsworth. And the fact of the matter is they can't.
Right.
Let's be clear.
Right. That's
And
right.
if it's
There
the
is a talent there.
spontaneous overflow, why is there such interesting prosody and rhyme? And that doesn't seem spontaneous. That seems artful.
Yes,
So
entirely, which you almost can't even figure out in
right.
Tintern Abbey. You know, why is that beautiful? It doesn't have the form. It's not an easily recognizable, you know, lyrical form, at least not to my ears. And I'm sure, and I bet to his readers, his contemporary readers, it was even more shockingly, you know, I'm sure it was rejected. I don't know this history, but I'm sure it was rejected by people. It's not poetry, doesn't count, breaks the forms. So, you know, it's missing what they would have said were the necessary pieces. So, you know, Barzun goes down the path to try to say, well, what does make the Romantic movement a movement? And he unites all of the disparate voices across history, music, fine arts, literature, poetry in a project, essentially. An idea of trying to remake the world after the classical world, the perceived or actual failure of the classical world. And he portrays the classical world as a world of structure and form that was taken as found, but wasn't found, was instead made and imposed and made beautiful things. Tintern Abbey itself is upon the Wye River and the ruins of a beautiful abbey that was fantastic. So it is a picture of the exact movement Barzun is describing, the crumbling ruins of something that not only time, but also history, Henry VIII had worked to destroy. And in the ruins of that, you bring yourself, your individuality. And I think that's the ground zero for what I'm interested in doing with the Romantic movement in class with my students, because I think the subjective individual, which is a hot mess of a place, is nevertheless important. And what the Romantic movement, the project of the Romantic movement, was to try to make a representation of the world that was not as limited as the classical, as grand as it was not as limited as the classical world, and took into account and took seriously everything.
Yeah.
Everything. The whole. They didn't want one or the other. They didn't want emotion or reason or emotion over reason. They wanted all. Everything at the same time.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
I like that presentation. I like that presentation of it. And Tintern Abbey is a great picture, a great place to start because of the picture of it, because of the ruins of classicism, because it's in a spectacularly beautiful natural setting, and then because it's also poetry in this
Yeah.
sort of iconoclastic form, for its time. And so it's
I
got it all. It's got it
I
all
was
together.
I was rereading a chunk of, I think it's Harold Bloom's first book. It's called Visionary Company. If it's not his first, 1961, one of his early books, and
Oh
it's his
yeah.
commentary on the Romantics, and it's a lot more coherent than some of some of his later stuff. But I just want to share a couple of things, and I want to say
Yeah,
to
please do.
teachers listening, I think it's really important to read like Paul's mentioning a book he's reading, and I'm mentioning a book I'm reading, and there's a zillion things we haven't read. It's obviously more important that we read the primary material, but I think it's really good to read these other brilliant people who've also read these books we're reading, because they can be our teachers. And I'm not going to overtly share Harold Bloom with 17-year-olds. They don't need that.
No.
The first time they meet Keats, it doesn't need to be through the prism of Harold Bloom. But what it does is it fills my mind with ways of thinking about it, and I have more options in the room.
Yes,
That's
that's
really what it ends
exactly
up
right.
being. But
Which
I
is
was
what you're
thinking,
scrambling for, right? That's what you're scrambling for. Is you're coming into the room. How can I? In what way can I? How will this touch down with students? What are they?
yeah.
What's going to catch their attention that makes them want to hear more? And you need ideas for that.
And you and I have talked about this. This is something that really is important to me, and I'm pretty sure it's important to you too, that forget the students for a second. I need to be excited.
Yeah,
And
that's
how
right.
is it that teachers of English can remain enthusiastic? Well, I think if we are allowed to read and reread really awesome things, hopefully, I mean, I'm doing Pride and Prejudice with seniors now.
Yeah,
I can do that every year for 30 more years and be very happy.
yeah.
Zero
Agreed.
problem. Every year I notice different things. I'm different. I interact with it differently.
Yeah, yeah.
But sometimes you need to interact with people, and sometimes really great teachers live inside of books, not in real life. So I think these books are good for that reason. But here's a couple of things he said, if I can share. And again, these aren't things I would necessarily overtly share, but we were just talking about, is there anything unique to the Romantics on the level of
Right,
ideas, and are there
right.
new things? He said the Romantics had a post-French Revolution belief that a renovated universe was possible, and that
Mm,
the soul could be saved outside of the hierarchy of grace. So, in other words, via
mm.
imagination and not some either governmental or religious structure.
Yeah,
So, that is new. I don't know. Like, Shakespeare to me is the most elusive. Keats makes a big point of this, talking about romantics, that he embodies this idea of negative capability, that living in uncertainties. You think he thinks one thing, but then an act later, another character says something the opposite, equally amazing and convincing. But Bloom says this, and I really appreciate this insight. Hopefully someday we can do some Paradise Lost together, because you'd go out of your mind, Paul. You would
yeah. That'd be
literally go out of
great.
your mind.
That'd be great to do.
Bloom says, if all deities, as Blake said, reside in the human breast, then all traditions of knowledge are human also. And it followed that the most human and complete knowledge was that of poetry. That's again a big Shelley thing.
Hmm.
And Bloom's, I think, early research was on Shelley, if I remember correctly.
I think you're right.
Milton is the fountainhead of this kind of belief, and yet would have rejected it in the conviction that it led to a satanic idolatry of self. It
Yeah.
is one of the great characteristics of the Romantic period that each major point, in turn, sought to rival and surpass Milton while also renewing his vision. I just
Mm,
care about Paradise Lost a whole lot. And it
yeah.
strikes me that when you talk about any period of literature after it, you have to talk about it. Like, the 18th century had a hard time writing poetry because they were just overwhelmed by the fact that he just happened. And the Romantics, Blake particularly, but Wordsworth has a poem about Milton. I think Keats has a poem about Milton. They
Yeah.
just can't. So
They
I
can't go
think
for it. Yeah.
the tentacles of Romanticism have a lot to do with the Iliad, the Odyssey, Shakespeare, they're great readers. These guys.
Yes, yes.
These
And
guys are
and
really, really
even
good readers.
17, I mean, even 17-year-old Mary Shelley is herself
Yeah.
kind of rereading Paradise Lost in,
Yeah.
in Frankenstein. It's a take. It's a
Absolutely.
take on the fall. It's a take on Adam and on God and on the results of the fall. And even she, I don't know what control she had over that, how much she knew of that, but knew exactly what she was doing, but she knew a lot, and it's there. So it's even there in in Frankenstein in the novel form.
Yep.
Yeah,
Yeah.
those are great. Those are great points. And I think that desire to try to find salvation, to find redemption outside of the structures or the pre-made forms is not a bad way of putting this project of trying to put together what also Jacques Barzun, who I'm reading on this, says the particular point of view that the Romantics come at the problems they're trying to solve is from a divided self, from a self that understands itself to be, on the one hand, capable of greatness, of the sublime, which is a word that gets overused when teachers talk about Romanticism. It should probably be thrown out, for a couple decades. But of the sublime, and then on the other side of enormous weakness, of a destructive capability, of on the one hand a creative capability, and on the other hand a destructive capability, of this sense of values and meaning, and then on the other hand of standing out in nature and being overwhelmed with just the emptiness, with the sense that nature doesn't care about you, at all. And those two things, trying to put those two things together. So the Romantic is trying to put the two dualistic experience of life together in various ways. There's reason and emotion on the one hand, but also power and weakness, creativity and destruction. There's like these series of dualities that you find sort of haunting all the different poets and the writers, I guess.
Yeah. No, I think that's good. And I'm tempted to say that Hamlet, Lear, Othello, Macbeth, Coriolanus all have what you just said, the divided self, that whatever. But I think what Romantics add, you just said something else that makes me think that, like, Romantics do have this sensibility that, Ozymandias deals with this, that you have, life on earth and you have like the greater sort of natural world. You have like, created art, like the sculpture in that poem, but then you have the natural world, and then you have human pride and human desires, but then you have the natural world that just overwhelms all of it.
Yes.
And the primacy of the natural world being the great power seems to be one of the things that the Romantics sort of add to the Shakespearean invention of the divided self. I mean, you can go from the tortured self inside of Othello and Hamlet to the tortured Milton. Satan, to me, is the apotheosis of this, even greater than some of Shakespeare's best creations. But then you have all the Byronic heroes throughout Romantic literature, whether it's Childe Harold and Byron himself or Victor Frank, like whoever. But it seems like the Romantics add that nature being overwhelming, which has to do with the sublime, right? Nature being overwhelming.
Yes. Yeah, that, if I had to vote, not really thinking that through, I might say nature. The addition of nature is the new element, and that's something they can't get over. It's as powerful as the influence of whatever great prior writer they're trying to overwhelm, or whatever world they're trying to remake. Nature is this character, and maybe it's a replacement for some classical conception of God. It probably is. It seems like that in the Transcendentalists, who are American update or American version of the British Romantics. I think nature in Emerson is ineradicable. In Thoreau, it's essential, and it's grand. He says it's grand and as great as anything the classical world possess. He says in Walden, the hum of the mosquito was to me the Iliad or the Odyssey.
And that's to perceive eternity in an hour. Is that Wordsworth? That poem, his Daffodils poem, all of it. It's like you can, a little tiny slice of nature, you can perceive all of reality. I mean, that idea seems to be original to them on some level.
Yeah, something like that. And the presentation is just the presentation of the self that like, in contrast to Plato or a classical conception of like the soul being represented by the charioteer, where you have reason is the charioteer driving the chariot, and then there's the two horses of feeling or emotion, some of which are good, some of which are bad, and you're trying to navigate the world and drive them and keep the right one, leading. That the Romantics, they see that as an almost like man is, and Barzun makes this connection, which I think is kind of neat, like man is a centaur. He's a human on top and an animal on bottom. Yeah. And the Romantics don't want that division. They want there's an equivalence between the mind, the driver, and the horses. The emotions, dark and sublime, are all a part of the same pool, and you have to the parts are the same, but the organization of them are different. And
Yeah.
they want to recast how those go together and push them together. And Enlightenment world continues classical world by treating humans as an update on the animalistic side, but making it into a machine, into the entire world, to this sort of clockwork universe, clockwork order, or this fantastically complex, and beautiful machine that can all be spelled out in a series of, what we'd say today, I suppose, are algorithms, but that's what Newton, uncovers, and discovers. And he's so fantastically successful with his discoveries that it has this almost irresistible pull, which we feel to this day. And the Romantics felt deeply and keenly that this does not represent the full or the whole of human experience. And so there has to be a different configuration, a different way of organizing the same parts, but with the addition of nature. And for me, and I think that's what I wanted to talk about tonight, is how, and it might be a way that we can sort of pull this together because there's so much going on here.
Yeah.
But how we made our way into Romanticism and the Romantic movement, which is what kind of shows up in our classroom to draw students in, to talk about Romanticism, not just because it's in every textbook and you look in the table of contents, you're like, oh yeah, we got to do Romanticism because that shows up, chronologically or thematically. Yep. But as you said, because it's something that's vital, something we care deeply about, something we think will draw students into this larger humanistic conversation that we feel like they need to be a part of. So how did you get into it? What was your starting point? What was your point of entry?
As a teacher?
For the Romantics? Well, I don't know. Even
or as a kid?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I had this great teacher, and it was a very traditional class. There was nothing unusual. It was close reading, and she just made it come alive. And I think as a teacher, the Romantic, it's funny. I think a lot of teachers in a Brit Lit survey class in a high school do things like Beowulf. You'll do a Shakespeare play, and I think after that, Frankenstein's pretty popular.
Yeah,
it gets hard in 2025 after that. Great Victorian novelists, unless you have advanced kids, are thrown by the wayside pretty readily these days, I think.
Yeah.
But the Romantics are challenging, not for a page count set of reasons, but I think they demand all of you in a different way. And they demand your ears, your eyes, your heart. They would want your heart.
Yeah.
Not just in a Percy Shelley, like literally Mary Shelley had his heart after he died, like his literal heart. So I think the first time I felt good about teaching them, I didn't teach the Romantic movement to kind of lower level seniors. I would do Frankenstein. And I might touch on some poems, but I didn't give a test on the Romantic. But when I taught AP for the first time about 20 years ago, I remember Keats is my favorite of all the Romantic poets. And I think he gets shortchanged a lot. Even my friend who teaches Romantic Lit, he's a later Romantic. Often you take a long time with Blake, Coleridge, and Wordsworth.
Sure.
And then by the time you get to Keats, you're like, oh my God, I'm going to rush through. I remember one year I had the class pick one of the odes, and I think they did Nightingale's my favorite, but I think they picked Grecian Urn.
Yeah.
And I said, we're going to do a 3-week thing. We're going to have a week where we just look at it and listen to it and then journal and talk. And I'm not going to give any thoughts. I'm not going to give an answer key. There isn't one. So we just kind of collected our questions, our thoughts, our observations, our problems, everything. Our favorite lines, our most problematic lines. And then the following week, they wrote a close reading essay. And they had 5 days. This is when we met every day, where they took all that stuff and they said, let me see what he's up to here, just looking at the poem. And then I curated a couple of secondary resources. So the following week, they read Helen Vendler's article on that poem in her great book on the Odes, which is the book on the Odes, and one or two other things. And I just said, it was very loosey-goosey, Paul. I was keeping my head above water, if I want to tell the truth. Yeah. But I said, in every body paragraph you had in your original essay, put a quote or two from one of these experts. Yeah. And then we talked about how do you interact with the secondary. But it was 3 weeks, and then we spent a couple of days just sitting around talking about how it went and process. But it was 17 days of looking at, however many lines Grecian Urn is, 50 lines, 60 lines. But the poem, the great poems, and you could list, Tintern Abbey, your poem's definitely one of them. Coleridge's great conversation poems, the rhyme, on and on, right? It stands up to it. And I didn't cover lots of Romantic Lit that year. I did Frankenstein and that maybe. but it was a really nice. I haven't done it in a long time, Paul, and just talking about it, it's like maybe I should go back to it.
I'm the same. I'm the
You
same.
know?
I don't know if it's because it's too personal or it's too, which it has been for me in some ways, or what. But I've shied away from doing it, even though it would be my favorite thing. And but somehow I haven't worked out well a way to break into it with students. So
Yeah.
that's interesting that you did it that way and just let it sit to see what happens, which is risky. And some kids, some students may not, have a great fulfilling time in that, but it gives you a chance to find out how or if Keats is going to work with students.
Yeah.
But you need that classroom tested kind of petri dish to work out
Yeah.
ideas. You just do.
And I think
You think is
nowadays,
important.
no, it's true. Nowadays, I have teaching ADD, so I'm changing up things all the time.
Yeah.
And when you do Brit Lit, I mean, there's infinite options. You and I have said for years, take away all our books, no problem. We can easily fill in a school year with other books, not even hard.
Oh yeah.
And I've prioritized different things. I mean, admittedly, I like some Blake. I like the early Wordsworth. I love Coleridge. Coleridge is one of the writers I want to have a drink with in heaven if I get there.
Yeah.
I find his I love, folks talk about Kubla Khan, which now that like some drugs are legal in Massachusetts, it makes more sense now than it used to make. Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner, I've had very little success teaching. I'll admit that to you.
Yeah.
His conversation poems, Frost at Midnight, about his little son sleeping in the room. He's awake at night.
Yeah.
What a poem that is,
Yeah.
And Keats is great. Shelley's best stuff is great. Byron, I show them She Walks in Beauty Like the Night, but I don't really teach Byron.
Yeah. Yeah, it seems untouchable. And maybe that's part of it. The novel, the Frankenstein, back to that, works. It touches down. I think that's a good reason to do it, but it may also be a good basis from which to try to grab some ideas or something from it. Grab this Promethean idea. Prometheus is, repeated throughout Romantic poetry, at least something, either literally or in what he represents as an archetype of the self, the romantic self, of being capable of greatness and then capable of destruction, also of alienation. This feeling of alienation in the world, of being at odds with the world and at odds with the gods.
Right.
That's an aspect of Prometheus. You teach at a Catholic school. I teach at a Catholic school now. I've taught at Christian schools. The connection to the Christ-like figure, the sacrificial character is sort of a way in. And for some students, it's frightening to think of a pagan mythological character as a Christ-like figure, or feels like, I don't know what, like it's not only unorthodox, but maybe wrong or bad or something. But for other students, it's enlightening. It's a way to open up their eyes and to think more and to think more broadly. So, but it's a way in, it's a way to, it's a way to touch down, which is what you're looking for. And it's hard. I think it's hard because it's so, I don't know, it's so human, and the poetry means most to you when you've had those feelings, when you've had those thoughts at some level, whichever one.
I remember I dated a girl named Jen. We were madly in love, underclassmen years. And if I had the textbook I had for Romantic Lit was by this Harvard professor named Perkins. I don't know why I remember that, Paul. I don't even know if I need eggs right now, but I know who edited my just this really nice hardcover book, really comprehensive Romantic Lit, anthology. And in some of the poems, I just put like JC, which were her initials, like next to the poem. And if I go downstairs now, like that's there, little like 19-year-old me thinking like Byron wrote this actually, but there's a lot of moments in literature and with the Romantics where it feels like the writer that maybe you had a thought, but this writer's captured it perfectly.
And that line, that is exactly what drew me in to the Romantics. I was not a reader through middle school or high school. You have to sit still in order to read. And that was not something that I could do. If I had had different parents, they would have had me drugged from head to toe for what they call ADD or ADHD. I don't know which, nowadays. And I'm surprised they didn't, because it was bad. I remember teachers, not being particularly pleased at my level of energy. So sitting down to read a book, I just couldn't do it. But I became kind of, and I wasn't a terribly reflective person either, but I sort of knew what I liked. I remember I started this habit of going out late at night we lived in one of those typical neighborhoods, but I would go out and just walk in the woods and get deeper in the woods. I had a dog, and we'd go and just find places. And I would go and find these fields and lay out in these fields, and just like the connection to nature came naturally to me. And I grew up in a rural part of North Carolina where the connection to nature had these pre-made forms, which are normally like hunting or fishing or riding four-wheelers or biking or something like that. Even going hiking in the beautiful mountains of North Carolina. You know, all of those forms of ways of interacting with nature didn't work for me. I mean, I did them variously, but that's not what I felt when I went out in nature. It wasn't captured by, it wasn't satisfied or answered by any of those like formal ways of interacting with nature. Going for a beautiful hike and sitting on top of a mountain or something. I like to do it, but that was not the connection that I felt. I would say that romantic, the expression, and particularly 10 Turn Abbey, was the first time I heard it, the first time I heard a voice that expressed, because Wordsworth goes back to a place he'd been before and describes the beauty of it, and then says, now that it's different, now that I'm grown up, it's completely different now that I'm here. And this is what I hear, and this is what I see in nature. And I couldn't believe it. I found something that was an expression of, and it went really deep because it went beyond theology in a way, which I think frightened me a little bit in high school, because you know, I was very, very committed to my faith, very religious, went to Christian school, went to church, all this stuff. And so it was important to make that connection, to think of God as a creator, God as, you know, in nature and all these things. And yet even the theological forms didn't get it, you know, didn't touch it, didn't speak to whatever it is I felt, you know, when I went out and, you know, walked under the moon or saw the trees or whatever it was. It was kind of strange, but I was weirdly connected, weirdly conscious of it. And the romantic poets sort of, you know, captured that, and it cut through all of those different forms. And then as I read more about the movement, it felt like that's what the movement was trying to do, was answering on a world historical scale something very similar. That there was an experience, a human experience that was easier to talk about if you talked about it in terms of nature, that just was not captured in the cultural forms, historical cultural forms that you could name prior to that time. So I think there was that natural, instinctive sort of existential touchdown, you know, for me, that I still feel, you know, in the movement, and made me just curious. You know, it set off that thing that I think you and I are conscious of trying to set off in class with our students, that innate interest or natural interest that gets students talking, writing, researching with a motivation they don't normally have, you know.
Yeah.
So that's it. That's it with the romantic movement for me. And I think it comes back as I explore it, think about it more. It really is discussions about the nature of the self, the nature of personhood, person in the world, and I think our students, as they're, you know, the age that we meet them, they're beginning or somewhere down the path of this road to self-knowledge, and introducing them to a tradition of literature and of thought that can contribute to that lifelong pursuit. Feels like the most legitimate use of this, you know, this literature and poetry.
And I think too, for me, I think to a large extent, the theoretical foundations of Romanticism, and more importantly, the way the poetry moves, provide a future for what we have now. That the theoretical foundations of how Romanticism viewed the self, as you said, has a lot to do with how people view the self now. But if you look up poetry in a modern dictionary, it's right out of Wordsworth. It's the language of expression, language of feelings, which is a terrible definition. It suggests that dramatic literature and novels don't have feelings, which is erroneous. But that definition comes from the Romantics. And, you know, looking for something to hang your hat on that isn't like a governmental or religious structure. That clearly is part of the ethos now. And it really gets its real strength, I think, at this time period. But I also think that the Romantics are the first group of people that said that everyday things are worthy of poetry. And as much as I love Shakespeare, that's not true for him. As much as I love Milton, that's not true for him.
Not the case. Yes.
But, you know, Wordsworth staying up all night with his little kid, or walking around with daffodils, or going back to a place that you used to visit years ago, or whatever, are suddenly, or hearing a nightingale sing out your window, like, are suddenly not just poems of themselves, but they ended up creating this set of cognitive leaps that can go in any sort of direction. So I think that is part of the newness of what the Romantics bring to the table. Just thinking of that.
Yes. And Emerson in the American context has the parallel. His great essay, Self-Reliance, essentially details sort of what you're describing, that you need not quote Plato or quote Socrates or quote Jesus or any of the greats. You should instead do what they did, which is to quote themselves. They spoke. They spoke.
Yeah.
Who did Plato? Footnote. There are no footnotes in Plato. Plato is the footnote, and he says, in the end, that's all you have anyway. And your reading of Plato will be an expression of you. So you may as well just say it now. This is me talking. I'm not even saying Plato. You're stuck with yourself. But it's not it's not an imprisonment. Actually, it's freeing. It is a path. And this is to the bigger point of being able to get to grand things from small things, which is that from yourself, from the soul, you can get everywhere anyone else has gotten.
Yeah. Yeah.
From the small, from the tiny, from the ordinary. And that's what the Romantic poets do. That's what lyrical ballads do, with words and language. You can get to as grand ideas as their American poets do it. Walt Whitman does it. Robert Frost is all about it.
Yeah.
And so that's the experience.
Yeah.
So how to wrap this, Jay, as an introduction to a romantic opener. We're finding ways into it to teach. I think, we're talking about the personal. I think the Romantic is a great place to bring your personal experience of literature and life and the meaningfulness of life to it. I like this new idea, as you're kind of looking for what's the new contribution. Nature, everyone's interested in nature. It's a great point of, well, not everyone, but, it's an easy place to find some common ground with students. I think those are good takeaways for talking about how to jump into a romantic poetry. And then also, Jay, I liked what you said about how to use secondary sources for finding ideas for jumping into the Romantics, because they're not easy to teach. Poetry's not easy to teach, but Romantics is not necessarily easy to teach.
I think we had discussed the possibility of maybe sharing a favorite chunk of a poem.
Let's close with that. Yeah. Did you
bring that?
Did you bring a chunk? Yeah.
Yeah. I just have a sonnet.
All right. Do that. I do have a section, my favorite section of Tintern Abbey.
Oh, I'm really glad you picked that. I'm really glad you picked that. This is my favorite poem about reading. Keats wrote it when he was 20, in case any of the students think they're, hot stuff. And the premise is so beautiful. Keats is a working class kid, actually, relatively speaking. And him and his buddy get together around 1816, and they got their hands on an edition of one of Shakespeare's contemporaries, this guy Chapman, who had a translation of the Odyssey. So Keats didn't have Greek, so this is his way in. It's not like there's a Barnes and Noble. So he just wrote a poem that was inspired by staying up all night devouring Chapman's translation of Homer. Yeah. So he basically says that he's read, lots of classical literature, inspired by Apollo, but he had always heard that Homer kind of ruled the roost of classical literature, as Keats says, ruled as his demesne, his particular area. And he's like, never did I know this until I read Chapman. And then the last third of the poem, like Shakespeare's sonnet, there's a volta, there's a little shift.
Yeah.
He says, here's what it felt like. And it's like when an astronomer sees a new planet, and when Cortez looked at the Pacific Ocean and they just all stared at each other while staring on a peak in Panama, or in the poem it says Darien. So what I want to say, and I just want to close by reading it, but what I want to say quickly is, you and I spent a lot of time talking about Homer.
Yeah.
And we spent a lot of time with students. But this is a romantic poem about Homer, because there's no justification for why reading it. There's no, here's what I learned morally from it or philosophically from it. Here's what it says about heroism. It's about the completely personal response to reading a book, which makes it a great romantic poem.
Yes, it does.
Yeah. So anyway, the poem is, again, 20 years old. Paul, give me a break, right? Don't you hate him? Isn't he the worst?
Yeah.
So, and he studied to be a doctor. It's not like he got a creative writing MFA and was, rehearsing this.
That would have ruined him.
So anyway, this is Keats on first looking into Chapman's Homer. Much have I traveled in the realms of gold, in many goodly states and kingdoms seen. Round many western islands have I been, which bards in fealty to Apollo hold. Oft of one wide expanse had I been told that deep-browed Homer ruled as his demesne. Yet did I never breathe its pure serene, till I heard Chapman speak out loud and bold. Then felt I like some watcher of the skies when a new planet swims into his ken, or like stout Cortez when with eagle eyes he stared the Pacific, and all his men looked at each other with a wild surmise, silent upon a peak in Darien. I would love to be able to write that at 51. Editors always say that Balboa was the first person to do this, but Balboa didn't fit into the line
Oh, really?
metrically. But my favorite moment is the caesura, the strategic pause at the end, because, and this is just English teacher poetry nerd stuff, but I think
sure.
kids could know this. A caesura, right, is the strategic pause, usually accentuated by some sort of punctuation. Looked at each other with a wild surmise, dash, silent, comma. So the word silent is bookended by pauses, which means we as a reader are reading this poem forced to stop and go, like he says he felt reading Chapman.
He makes you enact
Yeah.
his experience of reading Chapman.
Yeah,
He
yeah,
doesn't
yeah.
tell you about
Yeah.
it. You do.
I mean, that's really good.
That's deep.
That's just a little moment, but it's method reading for like a second.
Yeah.
So I love that poem so much. And I like that it occasions a conversation with kids about, when was the last time a book blew you away? What was that like? What book was it?
Yeah.
You know? So anyway, that's my poem.
And this is a poem trying to capture that experience. Again, like you said, he's not talking about Homer. He's not giving you some deep insight into, Homeric whatever's, or thought.
Yep.
This is what it was like for me when I read it.
Yeah.
It's astounding.
So
That's
good.
good. It's a great little picture of romanticism and the romantic sort of focus, which, it has, it's like Tintern in that it's not in the ruins of an old abbey, but kind of under the shadow, in the shadow of an old classic piece. Here's something new. So it's a world that's completely different, but lives under the aegis of, or in the shadow of, or it's somehow guided by or influenced by.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great picture, which is a picture I have of the romantic era in my mind. Either the shadow and ruins of the classicism, or within the grandeur of nature. It's both of those things in a way.
Yep.
Yeah, I've got a few lines here of Tintern. It's long,
Nice.
so I won't read it all by any means, but it's typically divided up into 3 sections, and the middle section is my favorite. And as I read, I was charmed. I remember reading it for the first time in college, and then visiting it not that many years later, and again revisiting it and being struck by it again. But let me give some lines here from the beginning. I think they start around line 50. Where Wordsworth describes going back to Tintern Abbey, a place he had been as a child, and he recounts what it was like and how it struck him at the time. And then this is his revisiting of that place, and he has different feelings. For I have learned to look on nature, not as in the hour of thoughtless youth, but hearing oft times the still sad music of humanity, nor harsh nor grating, though of ample power to chasten and subdue. And I have felt a presence that disturbs me with the joy of elevated thoughts, a sense sublime of something far more deeply interfused, whose dwelling is the light of setting suns, and the round ocean, and the living air, and the blue sky, and in the mind of man, a motion and a spirit that impels all thinking things, all objects of all thought, and rolls through all things. Therefore am I still a lover of the meadows and the wood and mountains, and of all that we behold. From this green earth, of all the mighty world of eye and ear, both what they have create and what perceive, well pleased to recognize in nature and in the language of the sense, the anchor of my purest thoughts, the nurse, the guide, the guardian of my heart and soul, of all my moral being. I'm in there. Third section starts after that.
Can you imagine trying to publish a poem now with the phrase moral being in it? The editor would say, show, don't tell, Paul. What do you
Not to
mean?
put too much weight on nature, but it's everything. It's all there. That, and again, like with the poem you read, it's an experience. It's a capturing of a personal experience of being back at a place that meant something to him at a different time. But now I see and feel something deeper, something grander,
Yep.
something that sets wherever the light of setting sun sets. It's overwhelming, but it's an attempt to capture something that our students, that we feel when we're out in nature. You don't talk about, you can't articulate perhaps, but it's real.
Yep.
It's a real thing. And that's a way in.
Yeah.
So that's sort of ground zero
That's awesome.
for me. And there's others after that we can get into as we do the coming episodes, but that's a good starting place.
Yeah.
But moving poetry, moving moments, biographical, our students are interested. Also, as you get work with them more closely, interested in your lives and in some way interested in how you got into being who you are, doing what you do, and connecting that with the literature is even more powerful, I think.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's
This
a
is
start.
this is going to be really fun. And offline, you and I are going to have to talk about how we're going to organize this, but we'd love thoughts, subscribe obviously, but we'd love people's thoughts. Is there anything within romantic literature you'd like us to talk about, particular texts that get a lot of attention, but you want a fresh perspective from like high school teachers? How do you teach them? Or maybe texts that you love that don't get any attention? It might be interesting for Paul and I to encounter stuff that we don't know really well and to kind of play with it a little bit.
Yes. Yeah, I'd love that.
But yeah, I'm really looking forward to this.
Yes. Yeah, me too. And I'd love that. I would love that interaction, finding out what teachers who really put a lot into it have done and what they found. That's what we're looking for. Stuff that's a little bit off script too. I've heard this stuff taught sitting in other teachers' classes and looking through, textbooks, just taught in really, kind of dead historical rote ways. And that, of all things, I mean, sometimes you have to do it, because you just got to get through material. But of all things, you can't do it with a romantic movie. You can't do it with the romantics. It's the worst, So
all great literature, this, and I try to make this point. I stole this from the History Boys, the Alan Bennett play. This comes out of their guts.
Yeah.
This comes out of their guts. Some of these people lived kind of dangerous lives, you know what I mean? And having these thoughts about things then were dangerous to have. Right. And I don't know, I think we have to honor how the stuff was created and what it might have meant to them.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's that energy is captured in it. Even someone who didn't live as dangerous a life like William Blake, talks about that. And the energy of the human spirit, and you're able to feel it and hear it in the lines. And Blake would be my second. He was my second choice after Wordsworth for drawing me into romanticism. So we'll have to spend some time on him.
I just think
we'll get a structure, we'll have it laid out, and we'll do it in an orderly way that's helpful. But we thought a looser introduction might be a nice way to jump in. So thanks for joining us, and we hope you like and subscribe and engage in the comments. That's what it's all about for strong teaching. All right, Jay, that was great. Thanks for sharing the two poems. Tony Hoagland was great, at the beginning, and the romantic poem at the end, the Chapman lines. Those are always good to hear.
Yep.
So, all right.
You too.
We'll talk to you again next time.
All right. Good to see you.